It's always such a pleasure when in the same part of the world as Andrew Solomon. I know you all feel the same way, everyone. And I can't let you leave. We have some more time here, but your book, Noonday Demon, I just would like to, if we could spend a minute talking about what's different now than when you wrote that book. Has anything changed?
Well, Noonday Demon was a book about depression, and it dealt at some length with my own experience of depression, as well as the experience of many other people. I wish I could say that we had reached the point at which we had much better treatments. We have a few more treatments. Some of them work for some people for whom the previous treatments didn't work. Overall, the rate of depression is not really going down in the world, treatments or otherwise. And I think we actually have suffered from a deep linguistic impoverishment, which had not yet fully set in when I wrote that book 25 years ago, which is that it used to be that if you were having a hard time, you would say, I'm miserable. But if you wanted to describe something much more experienced, you would say, I'm depressed. And then the word depression started getting thrown around, and someone would say, how's your little Joey? And you would say, oh, Joey's been really depressed. He had a baseball game that was supposed to be tomorrow, and it's going to rain. And that kind of stripped the word depression of a lot of its meaning.
Mm.
And then we got to the point where people started using these two words that were meant to indicate, no, I'm not just talking about it's going to rain tomorrow. I'm talking about something much more severe. They started saying either, I was actually psychotic, even when they weren't psychotic. Psychosis involves an inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy, and that's not what they mostly have. Or I was suicidal, which is something people who don't actually want to kill themselves often say to try to explain I didn't just feel bad, I was in the throes of a terrible, desperate mental illness. One of the many reasons, I think, one of many reasons that the rate of suicide among younger people has gone up is that these words have been so overused and no other words have been introduced. And if you want to prove to whoever it is you're proving it to, your friends, your circle, your parents, your world, your children, that your depression was of a whole other level, there is no language anymore, so all you're left with is action. If you kill yourself, then people are going to get it. And they're going to say, oh, I see. That person was really suffering. I didn't understand before.
Mm.
It's really sad that that would be the only way to
Mhm.
achieve that. But it becomes more and more true. So I think there's that problem. Yes, there are interventions like deep brain stimulation, which is the implementation of electrodes into certain areas of the brain that can help people with very, very extreme depression. There are more support groups, and there's certainly more openness about mental illness. And when people can talk about it, that can be helpful. At the same time, there's been an enormous rise in, I think, overtreatment. And Samantha Boardman recently wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, the headline for which was Depressed? Maybe you shouldn't see a psychiatrist. And it was about
Oh,
the fact that because there have been so many interventions proposed, and because depression has been so medicalized, that we've lost sight of the fact that actually, if you're really depressed, it might be because you hate your job and you should look for another job. And it
mhm,
might be because you're having a real problem with your mother, and the two of you need to sit down and work it through, or else just take some time off and not hang out together. Or it might be for all of these other reasons that are concrete and real in the world. And so there is a very strong medical element. And I speak to you as someone who takes antidepressant medication every day. And I have little doubt that without it, I would be a puddle on the floor. I'm highly reliant on it and deeply grateful that it exists. Having said that, I think the tendency to sort of say to people, well, I mean, if you're depressed, go see someone and get on some medication is trivializing of the experience that people actually have. So things have gotten a little bit better and they've gotten a little bit worse, and probably on average, they're about the same.
mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Kathy, I know you have a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, we've talked about a little bit earlier about finding your purpose, having kids find their purpose or know that they even have a purpose of being here. How would you suggest as a parent? I have three teenagers. Actually, they're older. Two of them are older now. I'm aging myself in a different way. But how do you help them find what their life should be? And how do you kind of cut that cord, parent to child, to allow that child to express themselves in the ways that lights them up, even if that isn't the path that you would have kind of wanted them to go? How do you support parents in their own emotions over watching that child either struggle without finding purpose or going in a direction that, wasn't exactly what you had expected when you found out that you were pregnant?
Right. Well, all children go in a direction that is not what you expected when you were pregnant. I mean, there are no children who don't come with surprises. Um, the difficult thing, I think, is to figure out when you should say to them, that's great. You want to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to be behind you all the way. And when to say, I don't think X, Y, and Z is such a good idea. And why don't you rethink that? And children, of course, don't like being told that their idea is a bad idea and that they should be doing something else. So that's always a kind of tricky negotiation. But I think that really you have to separate out, and it's incredibly hard to do, what will make me happy as a parent and what will make my child happy as a person, and are they the same thing? And if they're different things, I don't think the parent needs to be erased. I think you can say, you know what, it actually really does matter to me that you, I don't know, show up on my birthday and that you make a little bit of a fuss. I mean, that's a trivial example, but it's one that's there. I think you need to make some demands on your children, because I think teaching your children that relationships are not reciprocal ultimately leaves them ill prepared to have marriages or children or even friends themselves. On the other hand, I think you have an obligation to say to your child, I understand partly who you are, and part of it I don't understand, but I think you're wonderful anyway. And I'm always a little cynical about that phrase, unconditional love. I think, okay, I know that's the ideal. And yes, we all feel that. But there are also moments when I feel like you're doing everything I asked you not to, and you're being unbelievably destructive. And if you would only act better, it would be a lot easier to love you. And I guess the wish to love the child is enough to count as unconditional, but it's a negotiation back and forth. And the idea really is to give the child enough confidence so that the concessions to giving you a certain amount of happiness become not burdensome ones, but rather ones that feel attractive to the child. But these are very abstract terms, and it's very difficult in the narrow and specific to say, except that you have to figure out which of my values were just socially dictated and which of my values are actually fundamental to my notion of what it means to be a good human being. And if I have ideas about what it means to be a good human being, are they ideas that are broadly shared? I mean, there are notions of morality that occur in every possible society, people helping the sick. You can go to any tribal society in the most remote part of the world, people are trying to help the sick. That's obviously a value. Knowing how a table is correctly set, though it actually happens to matter to me, and I would like my son to catch on to it, and my daughter also. It's one of those things that many people manage quite happily throughout life without knowing how to do. And those obviously are extremes, but a great deal that falls in between. You have to be able to think it through bit by bit. And I think, there's that old choose your battles thing. You have to be able to say, here are the ways in which I think you're making mistakes, and I'd really like to help you to do things differently. And here are the ways in which, if you want to do it that way, I'm not going to argue with it. You go ahead and do it that way. You know how I feel about it. If it's making you happy, you go ahead and be happy. So I think that's the back and forth, but it's never simple and it's never straightforward. And it changes, because what your 14-year-old is able to do and express and what your 28-year-old can do and express are very different. And I think one of the frustrations of parent-child relationships is that you never get to be the same age as your children or your parents. I'm now 60, and there are things that my parents did when my mother died at 58, but when my father was 60 and when my mother was nearly 60, that I was rather angry and intolerant about. And now that I'm 60, I think, oh, I get it, but it's too late. They're both gone, and I can't really communicate with them. And I sometimes look at my children and I think, you'll get to a stage at which you'll understand my current behavior, but by the time you get to that stage, I'll be somebody else, and you'll have other behavior to deal if I'm still here, and you'll have other behavior to deal with. I will tell you just in closing that I was having a rather sentimental moment with my son recently, and I said, George, I said, all parents make mistakes. I said, and you don't know what they are while you're making them. And I really feel like eventually, the mistakes I'm making, they'll become clear to me, they'll become clear to you. I said, but there's no way for either of us to know them now. And I hope when they do become clear that you'll be forgiving of whatever the mistakes are that I've made. And he looked at me and said, let's start with that mustache. And as you can see, I no longer have a mustache. So I think also if you can inject a sense of humor into the conversation, that goes a long way to bridging some of the difficulties of communication.
That is so true. I have to go back to this. I'm processing what you were saying about how sometimes people will commit suicide just because they want to be heard. How tragic that is. And we often say that nowadays, we just want to keep them alive. That's our goal. But so how can I be a better listener for that child so that that child that's not an option, that the child feels heard?
Well, I mean, I think by trying to keep conversation open, I
Mm,
think we have to get away from, one of the most powerful organizations working on this subject is the Zero Suicide Foundation. And I feel like the Less Suicide Foundation would be a perfectly reasonable name. The Zero Suicide Foundation is a ludicrous name because suicide is part of the human condition. There's
mm.
an Egyptian text from the 10th century BC that I've been studying. It's all about a conversation a man is having with his soul about whether to kill himself or not. This has been going on since people developed the self-awareness that allowed them to understand that they had the power to end their own lives. So I think we also have to work around that. But I think we have to provide venues or contexts in which people can feel that they're truly able to express the pain and suffering that they're in, and in which they are notified that other people experience the same thing. And while I think social media is currently, despite all its problems, being scapegoated for larger problems for which it isn't responsible, I think people now see curated versions of one another's lives. And it's been fascinating to me as I've done the research I've done. I'll sit down with someone and they'll say, but look at these other girls. They look so much better than me. And I'll say, but you look like that too because you're using the same filters. I said, they're seeing your life and it looks like, and she said, I know, but mine is all filters and you say, no, but they're using the same techniques you are. And people can't process that. They think what other people present is reality. And so I think trying to introduce very early on, without getting into the elaborate language of Freudian psychoanalysis, the fact that how people look and how they are not the same is very valuable. And I remember at a stage when I was going through quite a rough time, my mother saying, and it was very literal, but it was very helpful. She said, if you could take all those people in your class who you think are doing better than you are, and each of you could take all of your problems and pile them in front of you on the table, you would happily leave with your own pile of problems and let them go home with theirs. She said, they've all got as many problems as you do. You just don't see them the same way that you see yours. And I think trying to make that clear to people is important because the nuance of thinking, this person appears da 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 da, but who they are is really that's a skill, and it's a skill that can be taught, and it's a skill that can be learned, and it's a skill that is not emphasized in modern education very much.
Hmm. Good point. Good point. There's a question here, and you talk about this, the difference between love and acceptance.
So that was really the theme of Far From the Tree was I felt because my parents were, my mother in particular, was not pleased about my being gay. And I, at the time, experienced her rejection of that part of me as manifesting an absence of love. And as I worked on my book, I thought, love is kind of intuitive. As I said earlier in this conversation, most people love their children. But accepting your children is very difficult. You have this idea, especially because tiny children seem to be so pliable. You say to them, do it this way or don't do it that way, and they act in the way that you've told them to. And then they get older and they don't respond that way anymore. And so what do you do with children who are responding one way or responding another way? Or how do you make sense of what's going on with them? Uh, and so I think I think what you have to do is to make sure that you can say to your children effectively, I love you more than the sun, the moon, and the stars. This thing about you makes me very uncomfortable. I know that ultimately it's going to be important for me to accept it because it's central to your character. I want you to give me a little bit of time and space because I am working on it. And I want you to understand that that's hard for me, not because of anything you did, but because of the way I brought up, because of the society I've inhabited, because of the experiences I've had. I am also a human being, and I am doing my best to come to the point at which I can actually look at who you are and say, that is fantastic. But even if I can't say about that aspect of you, that is fantastic. You mean more to me than the world, and if anything happened to you, it would be more devastating than if something happened to me. That, I think, is the message that you want to get across in a very simplistic paragraph.
Beautiful. Kathy, do you have one final question?
Sorry about that. I think that parenting is hard, and I love what you just said. I think that you talked about unconditional love and that being a phrase that feels a little off. I've heard it said that, my love for you is unconditional. And depending on behaviors, my relationship with you and parts of that relationship do have conditions. They have
Mm.
conditions of love and respect and mutual care for one another. It's a little off the topic of what you just said, but I really do believe that in human relationships, we have to set those boundaries, and you can unconditionally love someone because they are your child. But if they are in a space where they are not being respectful to others or to you, that there are things that you can do to make sure that they understand that our relationship does have some conditions. And that was one of the best ways I've heard that said.
That
So,
actually is very well said, and I wish I'd said it. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you can say to someone, "I love you. I'll always love you. You can't use cocaine in my house." When
yeah.
you're on cocaine, there are other children here. You're corrupting the other children. Your behavior is erratic and unpredictable. I'm here for you when you're ready to fight with this. And it's not that because you're using cocaine, I don't care for you and I don't think about you. I'll be thinking about you every single minute and hoping that you're getting better. But I just can't allow it to happen here in this way now. And so I'm going to have to force a separation, which is painful for me and which I know is sad for you. But it doesn't mean that I don't love you. But yes, you have to have standards of behavior. You can't just say, I'll accept anything and everything that you do to somebody, because that's not a viable way to bring people up. And because people have to learn that when they get out in the world, people aren't going to love everything about them. And that has to be clear to them, without even knowing what it is that people do and don't love. It has to be clear to them that love in general operates within a context. And then you get to these sort of huge, what does love mean and what does it mean for there to be any kind of love and so on. I think just love means when you're when you really need me, I'm here, but we have to work out our day-to-day life in a way that's viable for us both. Robert Frost had a poem that ended, home is where, when you have nowhere else to go, they have to take you in. And I think home is where they have to take you in, but ideally home is where they want to take you in. And unconditional love maybe is knowing that you have to take the person in at the end, but having a functional relationship is setting things up so that you want to do so.
The other day, Andrew, we welcomed Becky Kennedy, and when I asked her about, she talked about younger children, but I asked her what she wanted us to know about dealing with older children, and she said these teenagers, they're made to explore, try on different personalities, and go out into the world. Just make sure that your explorer is not a nomad, and that there's a home, a loving home for them to come home to. And I knew you would appreciate that. I have one last question. When we started this, and then we'll say goodbye. When we started this, you and I and Dr. Kathy were talking about gratitude. What do you want to say about gratitude?
Well, gratitude, I think, also is a sort of skill, and I think it's something that is learned. And I think that it's something that has disappeared to an alarming extent, especially in a younger generation. Um, I think it helps to feel that being alive is something that warrants gratitude, even when being alive is painful. I think it's important. There's the tired old cliche of sort of you have to finish your dinner because there are starving children in the developing world who need to who have nothing to eat. And I feel like, okay, but my having four more string beans isn't going to change what happens to them. But I think that so often people who are living baroque, complicated modern lives, they watch stuff on TV, the internet is full of things. They don't know what it feels like to live other kinds of lives, and they don't know how few people really constitute not only the people, those of us talking on this call, but everyone who's going to be watching this conversation now and in the future. And when I look at the things to be grateful for, I feel like the gratitude is not only gratitude for what one has materially and what one has emotionally and so on and so forth. It's also gratitude for living in a time when there is so much freedom for people to be themselves and not to be constantly fighting against who the world perceives them to be. And I think that the expression of gratitude, and I know the idea of noblesse oblige is a kind of 19th century notion, and people don't like it very much, and it sounds like some patronizing thing from the aristocracy. But the real nature of gratitude is to say, I am very lucky in what I have. Other people have less. What can I do to help those other people? Because in actually engaging with and inhabiting and becoming part of the lives of people who have less, what you actually have becomes manifest to you. And then there's a balance to be struck. The artist Ilya Kabakov, who I wrote about in my first book, who was a Soviet artist, became a very well-known international artist. He had gone through unspeakably awful experiences during the Soviet period and had been imprisoned and had lived in terror and so on. And I was once going through some sort of a rough time. And I said, Ilya, I said, I really shouldn't be talking about all of this with you because you've been through so much that I haven't been through. And he said to me, Andrew, he said, he put his hand on my arm and he said, the misery of the world is a constant quantity, and each of us gets his share. He said, go ahead and tell me whatever you are going to tell me. And so I think the ability to be grateful, but also to be grateful without erasing yourself in the process of being grateful. That's, again, a balance, and it's a difficult one to achieve. But without the gratitude, you have very little reason to stay alive. And when you actually do manage to help other people in a meaningful way, it's astonishing how it changes the quality of your own gratitude.
It's beautiful. There is a thank you here that I'm going to close with, and it's so very touching. Um, the parent is saying that on the day that she received her son's diagnosis, for which she's the only one case in the world, she was waiting for her husband to get home, scared of how to reveal the news. She stumbled on your TED Talk, How the Worst Moments in Our Life Make Us Who We Are. In that moment, you gave me the roadmap that saved my life and our family and started an effort that went on to save thousands of children's lives as a result. She wants you to know that.
Well, I'm deeply, deeply moved by that. Please thank her or send me her contact information.
Well,
That means an enormous amount to me. Thank you.
and for all the people that are listening and will, as you say, continue to listen, we're beyond grateful to you for this hour that you spent with us. Dr. Kathy, I know you joined me, Jerica, and all of you. We're giving you a hug. We're sending a hug and applause to you. Thank you
Well,
so
to
much. Until
everyone.
next time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.